So if I could invite our speakers to maybe sit over here at the table and prepare themselves to take some questions from our audience, and I'll just try and direct traffic a little bit if I can. So once again, if I could invite anybody who'd like to ask a question, please to do so now. And again, if, as before, we could observe the usual courtesy about maybe giving us your name and the organisation you're affiliated to if you are, just so we know who's asking the question. So would anybody like to start?
Christopher Dingwall was speaking earlier about Scotland. One of the issues which I think has been mentioned in passing today is the question of enforcement. Part of the problem is whether enforcement is done in a sensitive way that allows sensible things to happen, but also the lack of personnel to actually police that. And I wonder if you might have any comments on that in terms of the sort of things which have happened that you've just been describing, Mary's just been describing.
Unfortunately, we don't have enough enforcement. The difficulty is that we find that in this area around Mountjoy Square that a lot of the, as Garrett said also, a lot of the, well, I was going to say the landlords, but the people who own the properties, particularly landlords, they simply do what they like. Because they know that they can get away with it. Now, probably if there's somebody here from enforcement at Dublin City Council, they'll tell me that I know there is quite a serious enforcement case that they did pursue in Upper Gardner Street, and I don't know what the outcome of that was. But it's difficult. It's very challenging to do it. But the difficulty, I think, is that there is a feeling that you can get away with it. So that's what we have to change. The feeling that you can do what you like because it's only Gardner Street.
Yeah.
Mary Heffernan, OPW. I just wondered, does anyone have a view of the recent initiatives by the young people in Dominic Street and the new park there? I mean, I've just found it so sensational to go in at the weekends and just see the goodwill that these young people, free art books, the cafe, it's just so exciting. And for me, I'm just hoping that will set the seeds, that it doesn't have to be about bringing any of the squares back to classical beauty. It is so much about the use and people feeling they can go in there and enjoy themselves.
What happened in Dominic Street is wonderful. And when I worked with students in the area around Mountjoy Square, there was a lot of excitement about doing things like that. And there are other places in the city, in Sheriff Street, where similar projects are afoot. It's wonderful when that happens, but we also need input, I think, from the city in terms of making, for example, the squares apparently are not protected, statutorily protected. So I think we lack, even though we have legislation to protect buildings and protect, that we don't have that legislation to protect the squares. So we need both. Yes, it's great when you have that, and that's volunteer work. Those people are volunteers, so they will do it, but they won't keep doing it because no one can keep volunteering.
First of all, thank you to everyone. All the presentations today have been great. But I kind of feel the point that hasn't really been gone into fully is the tension between conserving both the built architecture around the squares and the squares themselves, and also reconciling that with modern day living. I was just wondering if the panel have any ideas about where you strike the balance between, for instance, letting children play ball in the park versus promenading, or allowing hotels to perhaps buy 2 or 3 Georgian houses on Parnell Square and kind of, add in ensuite bathrooms to the rear and that kind of thing, versus just leaving them there to rot. It seems to be it's all or nothing, and I kind of think that in reality it's about compromise. And if any of the panel have any ideas where they see that compromise falling between the two.
I think if you look at Mountjoy Square, you'll see it's not devoid of people. It's not devoid of a living community, a very diverse community with different wants, different needs, and I think the core thing is that there should be some basic principles around which any sort of regeneration or reinvigoration of an area are based, you must have good solid housing stock, you must have good shared community facilities. If you're going to improve something, it must be a genuine improvement. You shouldn't be taking something away, a well-used resource, unless you're going to replace it with something different and better. And where you've got ancient or heritage properties, you should make sure that they're conserved. They're an asset for all of us. And I wouldn't necessarily see it as mutually exclusive, that you can't develop and adapt for modern living without protecting and preserving what's there. They are compatible. But I think one of the areas that we feel in Mountjoy Square in particular is that there is a need from the state and statutory agencies in relation to some of the public realm and in relation to some of the enforcement areas, that is the responsibility of statutory agencies to take that on seriously, because that is one of the areas where we do fall down.
And I absolutely don't think that, that any of us actually who are involved in this have an all or nothing attitude. In Upper Gardner Street, for example, all of those guest houses it is because of those guest houses that probably that Upper Gardner Street still exists. They all have bathrooms en suite in former Georgian reception rooms, because they have to have it. And people accept that. So I wouldn't agree at all that we have an all or nothing. We're very flexible.
Drew, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm just going to add, the other thing that we've learnt is doing this in a very considered manner, being incredibly careful that you survey what you have already and make sure that you do that in every facet, whether it's biodiversity through to buildings, to talking to people who use these spaces, but also making sure that you talk to the people who don't use the spaces at the moment. That was a really interesting comment earlier about, was it 54 different nationalities? There are people who won't be using that space, but you must consult them, and you need to consult them because they will have a view. Also, that particular lobbies don't get hold of something, and something we've seen a lot in the parks in London is the dog walking lobby becoming more dominant than the people who want play areas, and you end up with these different factions. So using a conservation plan approach where different groups come together and present their cases is really important, and making sure that everybody's listened. And finally, I was going to say, I absolutely echo that issue about don't do competitions if you can possibly avoid them. I've seen lots of projects where a competition to a very vague brief is launched, and a really amazing scheme comes forward that either nobody can afford to build or it's just completely inappropriate, but by then everybody's aspirations have been raised and you try and squash it at your peril. So I would say if you are going to do a competition, it needs to be very tightly managed. The slide I showed of the park at the start of mine, Roberts Park, with a new bandstand, that bandstand was designed through a competition, but the brief was written that the shape, the size, the materials was all very tightly controlled, so that through agreement before the competition was launched, a design was almost agreed.
Just kind of following on from the last question, as two residents who live in the square, do you feel that you're overly regulated in terms of what you can do in terms of renovation? In terms of preserving what's there. I mean, I feel that there are some interiors that do need to be preserved if you've got historic plasterwork, but then surely there are others, you can change beyond the facade. I'm kind of interested in the dynamic between preserving the street and then preserving the building, such as what it may be, behind that, so that you can actually get something to work.
The thing is that, as you probably know, it isn't that you cannot change things in your building, it's that you require planning permission to do it. So if you can put forward a case and a reason for doing what you want to do, I would think you'd be favourably received, but maybe somebody from the planning authority would like to answer that, if they're here.
I think one of the things that really irritates us and aggravates us, I mean, when you get involved in a Georgian property up in Mountjoy Square or anywhere else, you know what you're taking on, you know the responsibilities that come with it. And I think it comes back to this issue of enforcement, and sorry to harp on about it, but when you see somebody doing the blatant breaches that we've witnessed, whether it's in terms of private rented housing, where you see somebody subdivide the first level and squeeze double the amount of people in to maximise the return, or you see somebody destroy one of the most significant buildings on the square for profit and get away with it, that utterly undermines people who want to behave lawfully and who have got respect and who do cherish the properties. And that's why it comes back to ensuring that, there's a proper line drawn and that that's enforced.
I'm wondering if we aspire to having a lottery heritage fund and how we would go about getting support for the idea.
Well, one of the things I was keen to demonstrate is that for the UK, the Heritage Lottery Fund has made a massive difference, and it's basically delivered a renaissance in the UK's public parks over the last 20 years. It has made that difference, and that's acknowledged, and we've learnt a massive amount. And generally, I would say at the moment, parks in the UK are in a good position. So if that's one of the things we care about, then I think that the lottery has done a brilliant job. That was one of the key messages I was keen to get across here, and it's a shame the Minister left so quickly this morning. But I think obviously the lottery is really significant.
Thank you, Drew.
Sorry, my name is James Kelly, and so you might remember I spoke earlier on. I just wanted to pick up on the point that was made in relation to enforcement, because I think that it's a very relevant one, and if you don't mind, can I speak for about 30 seconds on that? Okay. The first thing is that there seems to be a prevailing attitude in Ireland that enforcement is a victimless crime, and that it's a right to interfere with, change or alter your property, and that anything else is over-regulation. The first thing I'll say in relation to that is that non-enforcement has an economic cost. It costs everybody. When a property illegally alters its appearance or discharges waste onto the street or puts plastic windows in, what it does is it damages the value of the properties adjacent to it. So it is not a victimless crime. Mary and Karen's and everybody else's properties are affected by it. It also creates a nuisance visually, intellectually and culturally. That also is something that has an impact. Non-enforcement has an impact. The failure to comply with planning and the failure to comply with regulation has an impact, and has quite a big impact. This is something that we need to understand here. It's not coming across hard enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll pull that to a close, and thank you all for your contributions.